talking about how you can actually, if there were a government wanting to make changes, how changes could be made. So let's start with, you're all familiar with the backlash in the last 12 months or so in almost all European countries. It started with the farmers and became much more widespread to the extent that the so-called populist parties became much more popular in recent years, and that obviously is reflected in the European elections. But these protests and the rebellion had a tremendous impact on the thinking of the political classes in Europe and in Britain. You've seen what happened in Germany. The government almost collapsed over their crazy heat pump policies. The German government is in a deep crisis, not just economically, but also politically. It's a coalition government of three parties, the Social Democrats, the Green Party, and the Liberals. And together, the three parties are below 30% currently. So whenever there will be elections, some of these parties won't survive, essentially. And the green issue is part of the problem. Germany is deindustrializing very rapidly. And now, not just heavy industry, but now even the most important industry in Germany, the car industry, is facing an existential threat over these crazy net zero policies. So the European elections, although not much has changed in the running of the EU, because they form coalitions and make backroom deals, and the EU Commission is more or less the same as forever. But in terms of the backlash, in terms of the rise of the populist parties, the decline of the Greens, the decline of the radical left, there's a significant political shift in most European countries, and a realization that the green agenda is becoming a handicap for mainstream parties, and that the whole green agenda is becoming not just a political headache, but an economic problem for Europe. So there is a significant backlash against climate policies, against net zero, against the kind of top-down demands on heat pumps, electric vehicles. The latest thing is in Britain, but in other European countries as well, the demand on farmers to produce less meat and for people to eat less meat and for schools not to even offer meat, all in the name of net zero. So this political cost of net zero is something that has really emerged in the last 12, 18 months all over Europe. And remember, we've all been warning about this situation for at least 15 years, if not longer, and no one really wanted to listen. And we've always been meeting among ourselves, and no one wanted to listen. But I think it's the first time where I would argue that what we've been doing for all those years has actually begun to trickle down. There are now more, not just in terms of more and more people understanding what we've been saying and accepting that there's a problem, but even the kind of political division over this issue for the first time. Because for most of those 15, 20 years, all parties were all saying the same thing. That has changed. That has changed. And as I will try to show, it has changed, in particular in Britain. And of course, all governments have started to roll back. Every government has begun to water down. Obviously, the nations that are part of the EU won't be able to completely get off the hook. As long as they're in the EU, you are bound by European law. But governments have some leeway of rolling back certain policies or slowing down or watering down, and that has begun already. The big challenge will be how to get entirely off the legal obligations and the targets, the legally binding targets, because they are utopian, they're not realistic anyhow, but the question is how do you get actually off the hook? So net zero is becoming politically unsustainable. It's becoming clear, particularly to conservative parties, that they are hemorrhaging voters and support, a lot of support to the so-called populist parties who have adopted quite openly more skeptical policies and a much more realistic approach towards climate and energy. And so these conservatives, so as long as, you know, a lot of these parties don't exist anymore, but some conservative parties still exist, and those will have to deal with the problem of being seen basically as a you know, woke type of, I wouldn't say left-wing, but non-conservative platform. And you can sense already, and that's partially also to do not just with the problems with net zero and the cost of net zero, but also with the conflict in the Ukraine, the war in the Ukraine, and the geopolitical shift, that the EU is beginning to prioritize other things, particularly defense. So a lot of the 20 years of EU politics was all about climate and green issues and renewable energy and so on. That is beginning to shift more towards, okay, we have real problems now, and we have to actually do something about the real problems. And the old problems we can park perhaps a little bit. We can still talk green, but let's do the right stuff first. So there is now a clear shift in political and spending priorities. And I wouldn't be surprised if the whole green agenda will gradually, even at EU level, be downgraded. And I'll talk about why I think the EU will begin to downgrade the whole green agenda. So when I talk about the, you know, you've heard this, the left very often talk about the Overton window and how they can shift the Overton window to the left and how they can, and they've managed on many, many issues to make, you know, views mainstream that used to be totally radical and extreme. But now I would argue that there's a shift in the other direction. It used to be, you know, we were accused of being deniers and preventers and avoiders and whatever. You couldn't talk about this in public without, you know, everyone saying you can't say this, you can't say that. And now I find in my conversations, people are beginning to be willing to talk about these issues, particularly these policies.
May I just ask, I'm not acquainted with the term Overton window.
The concept is that making positions that used to be kind of taboo or radical mainstream. So if you think about people on the left, like homosexuals or transgender, or things that used to be 20, 30, 40 years ago, an issue that was regarded as taboo, or you can't really publicly talk about these things. If you have campaigners saying, look, this we need to talk about it, this is something we have to accept, you shift it from being a taboo into the mainstream. And that's what they call the Overton window, shifting something from the extreme left or the extreme right, same thing, into the mainstream, where something that used to be taboo or unacceptable becomes acceptable. That's the theory of it. And the climate issue and climate policy and net zero used to be the consensus, and you could not question it because it was quasi taboo and no one wanted to talk to you about it. You wouldn't be invited to any interview on the BBC or mainstream news. And now it's possible to discuss it, to debate it, to discuss it. It has become a mainstream issue.
Overton, is that a place or a person? Or?
I think it is a person. I'm not entirely sure, but I think it's a concept. It's a theory about how particular issues that used to be or are still at the extreme fringes, whether left or right, become mainstream. And campaigners, their ambition is always to make something acceptable or mainstream. From both, from the right and the left. And that's what's happened with net zero. Net zero now, in many countries, as far as I can see, has become something that is now controversial and debatable, and no longer everyone agrees. And so the debate is over, right? That's what we heard for 20 years. Stop debating, the debate is over. Now we have to do this. I mean, Ingmar just spoke about that. Now the question is, but is that the right way to deal with it? And so when I talk about this idea of the Overton window shifting, what happened here is that in Britain, and I guess in many other European countries, you have someone like Nigel Farage and his party saying they will X net zero if they win the election. Obviously, they won't. They didn't win the election, but by saying that and getting more than 10% of the vote, and now in the popular support now almost on 20%. Guess what? The Conservative Prime Minister then had to respond and said, "Okay, hold on, we're not going to give up, but we will water it down." That's what Rishi Sunak did, and he said, I don't want to damage you, I don't want to make your life miserable, so we will slow the way to net zero. But that was a response to the growing opposition to his own policies. And it didn't work, obviously. It was a bit too little too late. He lost. Reform got 5 MPs, is now basically almost as popular as the Conservative Party. And it's very difficult to see how the Conservative Party can ever win an election without the voters they lost to Reform or voted or lost for voting. So it's a big issue. And guess what? Here are the 2 contenders for the leadership of the Conservative Party. The first one said he will rip up the Climate Change Act altogether. He will amend it, which is kind of unheard of. But that tells you how much this has shifted. And the other, Kemi Badenoch, also very critical of net zero. So we have 2 candidates who are both critical of net zero, which is unheard of because for 14 years they've basically adopted these policies. But now in opposition and realizing that they have no chance of ever winning elections again, they're changing their tune. So this is what is happening in Britain, which, as I said, is the first time. And we had a debate in the House of Lords 2 days ago, when the government minister then, after the debate, there were about 5 people on each side of the debate, 4 against and 5 in favor of net zero. But basically, the government minister at the end of the debate in the House of Lords says, we have to acknowledge that the net zero consensus is broken. That's the new thing. The new thing is the net zero consensus is broken. And you only have a broken consensus, or you need a broken consensus to have a debate. As long as you say, well, we're all agreed, there's no need to debate anything because we're all agreed, there's no debate. Only if some, and we said, if the opposition starts opposing, that would be a good start, right? That's what oppositions used to do. They oppose. That's what they're called, opposition. But on net zero, there was no opposition. Never. So then the Robert Jendrik, one of the candidates, said he wants to amend the Climate Change Act. So how do you do that? How do you change the climate? How do you get off the legally binding targets? Well, in the first section of the Climate Change Act, it says, it's very simple. You just need, you need a majority in Parliament. That would be a good start. But you need also a legally solid foundation. And the Climate Change Act says the Secretary of State or the Minister can change the Act, amend it, under 2 conditions. Either the science has changed or international politics have changed. Science is more tricky because to find enough scientific kind of institutions or scientists who would say the science hasn't changed. The science hasn't changed. The science is just as it always was. There is still a scientific consensus in that the vast majority of climate scientists say the IPCC, basically take the IPCC position. So on the science, there is no chance of changing the Climate Change Act. But on the politics, particularly on the international politics, there is an opening. And I'll be talking about this opening. What could it be that a government, let's say in Britain, the next government perhaps, could argue has changed? So there are 2 things that could change easily. Number 1, Donald Trump wins the US elections and takes the US out of the Paris Agreement. Okay? Clearly, if that were to happen, a British government could say, well, without the Americans doesn't make sense anyhow. Right? The second scenario is the international climate agreements become deadlocked. There's no agreement to the future of, and in particular, I will talk about that, of the COP system and the climate finance, and there's a deadlock, and that can't be overcome. That might be the second opening. So I mentioned already, if Trump wins, he's already basically promised to take the US out of the Paris Agreement again. And there is a fair chance that the COP that is going to open next month in Azerbaijan, it might not fail, but it might not achieve an agreement on climate finance, which means there won't be any money for climate policies internationally, because this 100 billion agreement from Copenhagen, you remember, I think the agreement was reached in Paris, but the pledge was originally made in Copenhagen that the kind of developed world will hand over 100 billion every year to the developing nations for climate issues. That runs out next year. And the COP29 in Azerbaijan is talking about, okay, and where's the future money coming from? Now I'll talk about that in a minute. The big issue to monitor for everyone is the controversy basically about the status of China in all of this. I mean, we're all aware that whatever we do here in Europe in terms of reducing CO2 is completely futile because we're swamped by Chinese CO2 emissions. The problem, of course, is that China is officially regarded as a developing nation. And as a developing nation, they don't have the same obligations or the same targets or the same legally binding targets as the developed world. And that may have been okay 30 years ago, but China is no longer a developing nation. It's the second biggest economy in the world, it's the biggest importer in the world, and it's certainly the biggest CO2, by far the biggest CO2 emitters in the world, but it doesn't have the obligations that Europe has or other Western nations have. And the Chinese have also said that they will be forever a developing nation, forever, right? So forget about trying to push us. We will always be basically a developing nation. And that's the official party line in China, because they know their success depends. Their success, their economic success, to a large extent, is due to their ability to produce with very cheap coal things much cheaper than we do with much more expensive energy. So if you look at our decarbonization efforts and reduction in CO2, on the left you can see Britain compared to China, and on the right Europe compared to China, is completely futile, right? So whatever we've been doing for 30 years have been, and that's why CO2 emissions are not going down; they're going up, and it's an upward trend. And they're saying, oh yeah, perhaps this year or next year it will peak and then will come down. It won't. It won't come down because there are too many countries catching up. It's not just China. There are many other Asian countries as well.
Can I make a comment?
Of course you can.
Because I was very much looking at these figures previously. And if you look at per capita, it's another story.
Not really.
Well, at that time it was.
At that time, but now China in a couple of years' time will overtake Europe in terms of per capita emissions.
Yeah. But this is not per capita, this is total.
I think I've got a per capita here. There's per capita. You can see that China is very close to overtaking the EU or Europe.
It's still less than.
Yeah, it's still less. Yeah, it's still less, but that doesn't mean they won't in a few years overtake Europe. And i.e., it's not a developing country anymore. 30 years ago, fair enough, but today it's a completely different world. So, and in any case, you can argue as much as you want about, is it now more a middle-of-the-road country, or is it a developed country, or is it a developing country? It doesn't really matter. What matters is that both the EU and the US are determined to make China pay. So what is happening, and just before I come to that, China is essentially free riding on coal. Their economy is basically based on cheap coal. They've got plenty of it. What it means is that all the renewables and so this is just drops in the ocean. If you see their energy mix is mainly fossil fuel based. We've seen this already. And of course, what is the result? These are the industrial electricity prices. And you can see just how much more competitive China and the US. Obviously, we know the US is basing their economy mainly on cheap gas, the Chinese mainly on cheap coal, and the Europeans on expensive renewables. So that is the result, the end result of unilateral net zero policies. You're shooting yourself in the foot, you're undermining your economy, you're giving your competitors a big benefit, and then you start crying. I mean, that's what happens. So what is the effect of China being able to use cheap energy? They're producing 98% of our solar panels imports, right? They're producing electric vehicles that are 30-40% cheaper than European-based or produced EVs. And of course, somehow even the EU is beginning to get concerned that their lovely green policies are basically benefiting China more than European workers or industries. Okay, so this is the background to what comes next. And what comes next, this is, by the way, the end result of 30 years of unilateral climate policies. You can see the tremendous drop in European share of GDP, global GDP, and the tremendous rise of China in that period of time. That's what happens if you take your eyes off the ball of a competitive match. So what is happening, and it has happened without a lot of people even noticing, is a behind the scene and sometimes even public attempt to make China play at a level playing field. So the US has adopted a very strong bill called the Ending China's Developing Status Act, and that is kind of unanimous. Both Democrats and Republicans have adopted that in both houses in the US, basically saying the US will no longer accept any international agreements in which China is not identified as a developed country. Giving up that status is the top priority in the US, and interestingly enough, is becoming a top priority now in Brussels as well. So in Brussels, what is happening is the EU is going into the COP, which I said is going to happen next month in Azerbaijan, with a demand that China will pay up to the demand of climate finance. The developed world is expecting something like $1 trillion per year, which is not going to happen, but that's what they want. And the EU is essentially saying China has to pay up. And the G7 is actually saying not just China, but also Saudi Arabia, and they're even talking about India, right? So basically, what they're saying is, if they don't pay up, we won't. So this is how I would read that. There is, for a start, I mean, $1 trillion a year is peanuts. Britain is expecting to pay 18 trillion in reparations. So with, here $1 trillion, there $1 trillion, in the meantime, they're both basically totally indebted, the EU and the US. But that's what the expectation is, that somehow they cough up $1 trillion every year to hand over to some well, I don't even want to say where the money will end up, but you can imagine that's the expectation. And the EU is saying, and the G7 is saying, we're not going to pay unless China, possibly Saudi Arabia, and a couple of other, what they regard as wealthy developing countries, cough up money. That will be the big debate in Azerbaijan. And that might be the way out for the EU of the big hole, green hole they dug for themselves. Because once you make the demand that others start playing, at a level playing field, if that's the demand, then you can basically roll back and say, well, if they don't, we won't play anymore. We're not there yet, but I can see that this is the game the EU is starting to play. And the US is certainly playing that, although under the current administration, they've rejoined the Paris Agreement, but they might be very reluctant, even if Kamala Harris wins, reluctant to somehow come up with $500 billion every year to their competitors, because that's what they are basically, they're subsidizing their competitors. So you will see this battle over climate trillions. The African group is calling for 1.3 trillion per year by 2030. The Arab group is calling for 1 trillion from 2025. The like-minded developing countries are calling for 1 trillion per year. As I said, 1 trillion here, 1 trillion there. It's a game that won't have a winner or a loser, in my view. Others want 5 trillion. I mean, well, as I said, there's now people saying Britain is owing some African countries and Caribbean countries 18 trillion in reparations for slavery. So we're talking, plenty of cash. And of course, China and India are saying, no, hold on. This is you, Western countries, you have to pay for that, right? This is our condition. We weren't signed up until you pay. So this is the monitor. Watch this game, this poker. It will be fun to watch. I can promise you that. Have I mentioned that the EU needs some trillions itself for their net zero plans? I forgot to mention that, because they said, well, we have to. You remember Draghi and his report a couple of weeks ago where he said, we're losing global competitiveness. We need to spend at least 800 billion every year. Okay, so a few more trillions. So, and of course you have now basically a geopolitical battle between two major groups, the G7 group of Western nations versus the BRICS country, right? The BRICS came together in Copenhagen. You might recall that's when they actually found their strength, when they came together to make or break the Copenhagen COP. But that's the situation. The G7 is demanding wealthy developing nations pay up. The BRICS are saying, no, thank you, you pay up. So who will cave? Who will give in? Who will win this battle? So I'll make a prediction that the COP is unlikely to fail. They always come up, always 5 minutes past 12. It's always the same ritual, it's deadlocked and then they meet and they huddle, and then they come up in the last 5 minutes after midnight with some kind of wishy-washy agreement. It's a ritual. It's has been done for 28 years. It will be done for another 28 years, no doubt. But I think that this deadlock over the climate trillions won't be resolved and might be kicked in the long grass. And it might be that issue that kills the whole net zero agenda. Thank you very much.